Hey, welcome back. I've already got our environment set up here. I've got our index.html page, the index.js loaded up, and you can see on the right hand side, I am showing the browser output. So I go to the index.js page, you can see these console logs, which is what we're seeing up here. So if I refresh this, you'll see just those two console logs. And so let's go ahead and start a discussion about these notes that I have in this video. The very first thing that we're going to talk about here is querying the DOM. How do we find elements? I have this web page and I want to interact with things like the button or maybe this input box. But the very first thing I need to do is I need to be able to find them. And the last time, we showed this document object model, which is right here, and I could use this selector and find things. This is how I would do it manually in the browser. So I found that DOM element right there, but I don't want to do that programmatically. As an example, let's find this whole form right here. So that form, I can hover over it and see it, highlight it there. And if I look at it, it has an ID of add-stock. And so we can certainly find things by ID. Let's go ahead and query by ID. So here's query by ID. We're going to do a couple. I can define that form. I can use the document object model, and we can use the getElementById. It takes a string and it just takes the ID, which is add-stock. So let's go ahead and put add-stock here. I'm just going to make a note that we're using the getElementById call. All right, so if I refresh our page now and I go back to the console, you can see that I've selected the whole form. So that's one way I can use getElementById to select that whole form. Now let's go ahead and select the table. If I look at the table, let's find it. Table right here has an ID called stock table. Let's query by ID a different way. So I can use this querySelector function. Instead of putting stock-table like this won't work. All right, what I want to do is prefix it with the pound sign. That tells it that I want you to find the elements that have an ID of stock table. So again, we are querying by ID here, but now we're using the querySelector to grab that table. So I refresh, go back to my console. You can see here's the form and here's the table. So when you use which method will be determined on what you really want to do. A lot of the times we're doing more complex queries. If you're only gonna just getElementById, then doing it this first way is totally fine. But maybe you want to change some selectors, which we'll learn about in a moment. Then you probably want to use the second method. So I look at, for example, this table. You can see the table has 2 rows. So maybe I want to be able to select all the rows that are in this table. So let's go ahead and see how we do that. We're going to query by, in this example, element type. And because of all this code, I've already written this code. I'm mostly retyping it. But to make the videos a little shorter, we don't need to watch me retype everything. I'm just going to copy and paste some of these things as we go. So here is our first query. We're going to use our querySelector and we're going to get the TR. And you can already see a hint that this is going to return the first element that matches this querySelector. So let's go ahead and refresh over here, and you can see that the element now is the first TR. Now you might be surprised that this TR is the header. It's not the first row, the Apple row, but that makes sense when you look at this because this header really has a TR element right there, and that's the very first one that's encountered in the document. So the document search is going to start at the top, and as soon as it finds the first TR, which is right there, it's going to stop its search and it's going to return that one. Now, if you wanted to find all the TRs, let's go ahead and copy and paste that code in. Now I'm using a different method on this document, which is called querySelectorAll. And in this case, it's going to search the whole document, not going to stop after it finds the first, but it's going to search and find all the elements that have the TR tag. So let's refresh over here, get to the console, and now you can see there's a NodeList returned. And there's actually 3 elements, the header, the Apple row, and the Google row right there. And for our next example, let's take a look at this remove button here. You can see that button has a certain classes. It says a text-red-500, that gives it the red color. There's a hover text-red-700. So as I move the mouse over it, you can see it turns a little darker. You can see that. And then there's one more class there, remove row. These other 2 classes are tailwind classes, but this last one is an application-specific class that I added. So let's see if we can select by the class. So drop in some code here. So this is query by CSS, and we're going to use our querySelectorAll. That's going to find all the elements. Here's the class, remove-row, which is what you can see right there. To query by class, we prefix it with a dot. That tells the selector code that, hey, I want you to look at all the classes and find the elements that have that class. So let us come over and refresh our page, and you can see I get this node list. There's 2 buttons. Here's the first one, and there's the second one. All right, for our next query, let's go ahead and take a look at these rows one more time. If we look at the Google row, I got this highlighted right here. You can see the Tailwinds classes, border-b, hover, transition, but you can also see there's another attribute here, a data-symbol equals the symbol for Google, which is GOOGL. And sometimes I want to select an element by its attributes here. So let's go ahead and select by a data attribute, and we're just going to copy and paste some code in here. So query by attribute. Using our query selector again, so I'm going to stop after I find the first one. How you specify that you want to query by an attribute is you use these square brackets. So that's the attribute inside the square brackets is data-symbol equals Google, which is exactly what you see here on the element. So let's go ahead and run this. Switch back over to the console, give it a run, and you can see that I've selected that Google row into a Google_tr variable. And do note that my naming convention kind of lets you know what you're dealing with. So for example, I have a postfix of an _tr. Here's an _btns. I know that this is a tr element, that's a tr, these are buttons, this is a form, that's a table. So far we've done these selectors one at a time. So we've selected by ID, we've selected by element type or a class, but you can combine these to make some really powerful selectors. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste in the first one here. Let's take a look at this one. Let's look at the selector first. We're going to first of all find all the elements that meet this criterion. We're going to start with tBody. So it's got to be in tBody. So I look at my DOM, it's going to be within the tBody element. And then once I'm inside of there, I want you to find all the TRs that are part of tBody. So it has to be these 2 TRs. Not the one that's inthead. So this is how I can eliminate that first one. I don't want the header, I just want the data TRs. So let's go ahead and refresh this. This is the stock TRs and we'll see what we get. And now you can see my node list isn't the 3 because it doesn't include the header, but now it's just the 2 data TRs. Here's another example of combining selectors. So inside my tBody, I want you to select the TR. Again, we just selected these 2 TRs. You can see them both right here. But I want to make sure that the TR has an element that looks like this. So if we look at the DOM here, this is a TR. It has a bunch of TD elements, but then there's this other thing here that says .text-green. That says that the TD element has to have a text-green-600 class. And so you can see right here is an element that has it. Here's a TD that has a text-green-600. If I look at my other TR, it has a text-red-600. This selector, if I run this, I'm expecting only to find the first TR. If I go over to the console, I get a node list of 1, and I'm only getting the top level TR right there. Now, if there were multiple that satisfied this, I would have gotten multiple because I used the querySelectorAll. But these are all the stocks then that are up. So they have that attribute that's green. It tells me that they're all up. And as a final example, here's how we can chain an ID. So this is a querySelector. I'm going to start with the element that has the ID of add stock. And we already know that that's our form that's at the very top here. So I go back up to that form right there, has an add stock. Then I'm going to look for a button. So I'm going to go through here and look for a button, but that button has to have an attribute called submit, type equals submit. So this particular button has that attribute, so we should find the submit button in this case. Sometimes forms have multiple buttons. They might have a submit button and maybe a reset button or a cancel button. And so this really allows us to specify that I want that submit button. So here's the add stock submit button. So as you can imagine, that searching the DOM, if you have a very large HTML page, can be an expensive operation. You want to try to make everything as fast as it possibly can. And so you can limit the scope of your query. For example, here, all of these queries, they all started with the root element, which is the document. So they all started out here at this HTML, and then they searched in the tree to find or select those elements. But let me copy and paste some code here. Here's an example of how we can limit our query scope. So I already have this form element selected. I paid the price for that selection and finding that element up here. I searched the document for that add stock form element, and now I have that. Once I have it, I can use querySelector within that form to find the first input. I can use the querySelector within the form to find the first button, and then I'm just console logging out those. So I refresh this and I come over here. You can see at the very bottom, I'm limiting the scope. I did find my input. I did find that button, but the difference between, for example, this query and this query is that this first one, I started at the document level and I had to search from the top down until I found that button. Here, I've already narrowed the search to the form, and I start my search at that form level. In this particular case, probably doesn't matter much because the document is so small. But if you were repeating this query a lot, then maybe you want to narrow that scope down so that it only starts with the form. Just like we limited the scope here, once you have an element and you've already queried that element, then we know that there's relationships between elements, like they have parents. They all have one parent going back. They might have multiple children. And so we can look and we can see, for example, parent-child relationships. I'm going to go ahead and paste this code in. So here's two queries. We're going to have that form element. We're going to get its parent and we're going to get all of its children. And we're just going to look at those two. So that form element, here's the form element's parent. It's the div that contains the whole form. The children of that form are the input and button. You can see them both here. So here's the input and then here's that button element. And this children is really just an array. So you can index into it. So for example, my Google TR that I found up here, which is that whole row. If I look at that whole row, here's the TR. It has all these TD elements. And I can see, for example, the price is right here. That's the TD element, and it's a 0 index, so 0, 1, 2. So at index number 2, I'm expecting the price. Now this kind of search is a bit fragile. It depends upon that you know the structure, and if you're the developer, you probably do, so maybe it's okay. At this level, I can get the price TD. Once I have that price, I can do other JavaScript. Let's go ahead and add these other two lines. Once I have the price TD, I can get the inner text. And the inner text is $2,731 and 23 cents. So I can trim it up in case there's any additional spaces or anything. I can replace the $sign with a space, and then I can parse out that float. So I can get actually the price here. So I'm going to refresh this, and you can see we have the price TD because we got it from indexing into that array element number 2. And then after that, we parse the inner text and we get a float back here. All right, sometimes you're going to be given an element. Maybe it's the Google TR. We already have a variable for that. Then what I want to do is I don't want to search inward using the query selector this direction, but I want to find going back out this way. And so what I can do is I can use a function called closest. It will essentially do a reverse search in the DOM tree until it runs into whatever I'm looking for. Let me copy and paste some code. As an example, if I start with my Google TR, which we just talked about, I want to find the closest T-body. So here is my Google TR. The closest T-body happens to be the parent, so I could just get the parent in this case. But let's say that we're really starting with kind of this element down here. It would actually navigate back to the closest T-body. So it's going to go back this way, find the first T-body, and then we'll console log this out. And so the closest T-body is that container right there. Typically, selecting an element is the first step into what you want to accomplish. Some kind of interaction with the element, or you want to accomplish, maybe you want to try to get some data from the element, or you want to modify the element, maybe change its color or whatever. So let's go ahead and take a look at that next step. We'll just, every element is a node really. And if I come back over here, every element has content inside of it. And so this TR has HTML content, this TD has text content, and there's different properties that we can use off of these elements that we queried to show some of that. I'm going to show 3 different ways to get, for example, our form, our innerText, our innerHTML, and our innerContent. And let's just see what they all do here. So I'm going to refresh and let's take a look at our last console log. This form that's up here has, remember what it looks like. It has an input element, it has a button element, and the input element doesn't have any children. The button element has a text node as a child. So if I come back over to the console log, when I look at my innerText, it just says add stock. And what this is if I look at this whole thing, it's really just the text for the button. It's been collapsed all the way down. The innerHTML shows us the whole thing. So I know that that form has an input and a button, and you can see all of the tags and all of the attributes associated with it. And this kind of gives us a clear view of what innerText did. It essentially removed all the tags and all the attributes. It left us with the text elements right there. So add stock is the only text element. And innerContent did something very similar in that it removed the tags, but you can see the spacing here is a bit different. innerText took all the spaces out, so it's kind of trimming that string down a little bit. textContent itself didn't really trim it. I still have the space where the input was, the space where the button was. Now I could, for example, come in here and say textContent is equal to nothing. And let's just see what this does. So I'm going to refresh this page. Watch this area up here. As I refresh, it's gone. If I come back up to my DOM, let's go find the DOM. I open this up, H1. Here's the div where supposedly my form is. Here's my form. But you can see that the form doesn't have any children anymore because I've removed them all because I set this to an empty string. Now I could do something different. I mean, I could set this to whatever I want. And this isn't necessarily how you want to build DOM elements. We'll talk about that in detail in another video. But for example, I can set this text content to this. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. And again, watch the form element, which is up there at the very top. And now you can see I've got this text in there. And it isn't really what you might have expected here, because this text content, I said, well, this is all just text. Just show it as text. And you can see that HTML elements here are not really rendered, just shown as text. But if I wanted to render that, I would set the innerHTML to this. Let's go ahead and refresh this page again. And now you can see I get this title and this paragraph. So this is certainly one way I can start to change the DOM elements. And again, we'll talk about proper way to modify or create elements later on. But this is one way that I can do it. It's an easy way. I just change the innerHTML, but it has some issues. And we'll talk about those issues in a later video. Let's take a look at this. We already have this Google TR, and that TR is down here. Here's the Google TR. And what I want to do is I'm going to get all the attributes and we're going to print them all out. So let's console log them out here, refresh. And so here is all the attributes for the Google TR. And you can see it has a class attribute and a data-symbol attribute. That's what we saw when we looked at the elements. It has a class attribute and the data-symbol. And then each of these, if I open them up, has a value. And so you can see here's the values for those. Now the DOM allows you to add new attributes. So you might want to add, for example, a custom attribute. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I can set an attribute on the Google TR. Its name is going to be my_attribute, and this is the value there. If I refresh, first of all, let's go and look at the elements. You can see that the TR now has a my_attribute, and this is my attribute. So I just added a new attribute here. And when I console log out, you can see that now the attribute class has 3 attributes. And just like you can set an attribute, you can remove one. So let's just go ahead and remove our custom one. If I refresh this, we shouldn't see any remnants of that. So it was added and removed. And if I look at my node list, it's back down to 2. Another example is maybe you want to add a data attribute. Adding data attribute using this pattern is very common. So data dash, and then you put your attribute name, URL. So maybe this is the URL to Google. So if I refresh this, now you see a data-URL attribute, and I can open it up and I can see the value. Finally, I'm going to give you an example here with a note. The note is because we will learn better ways to do this, but now that we have access to this attribute, I can add a style attribute that has like a background color. So for example, this Google TR, that's that row right there. When I run this, I added this style that has a background of red. And so that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to dive more into editing the classes and the styles of these elements. And there's a better way to do it than using this set attribute like we've done here. So we'll get at that next time. We'll see you then.